March 3, 1943. A Japanese destroyer captain watches 8 American bombers approach at wave-top height, and he's not worried because B-25 Mitchells are medium bombers, not gunships. Then the lead aircraft opens fire, and he counts not 2, not 4, but 8 50-caliber machine guns ripping through his bridge before he can even give the order to shoot back. Within minutes, 16 Japanese ships are sinking in the Bismarck Sea, shredded by bombers that were never supposed to fight this way, modified by one obsessed engineer who turned America's factory advantage into a flying massacre. The Japanese called them flying porcupines, and their own captured pilots would later admit in POW camps that facing these gunships felt less like combat and more like industrial murder. But here's what haunts those survivors even today. If America could casually mount 18 machine guns on a plane just because they could, what else did Japan never stand a chance against? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the winter of 1942, the war in the Pacific was going very badly for America. Japanese forces controlled everything from the gates of India to the islands near Australia. Their navy sailed wherever it wanted. Their Zero fighters shot down American planes like clay pigeons at a county fair. American bomber crews flew missions knowing they probably wouldn't come home, and the ones who did come back brought stories that made commanders sick to their stomachs. The problem wasn't courage. American airmen had plenty of that. The problem was that courage doesn't mean much when you're flying a plane that can't fight back the way it needs to. The B-25 Mitchell was supposed to be America's answer in the Pacific. It was a medium bomber, sturdy and reliable, built by North American Aviation in factories that ran day and night. The plane had 2 engines, a crew of 6, and enough range to hit targets and make it back to base. But it had one terrible weakness that got men killed. The front of the plane, where the bombardier sat, was just a clear plastic nose cone. Inside sat one man with one machine gun trying to aim while the whole plane bounced through tropical storms and anti-aircraft fire. When Japanese fighters came at them head-on, that single gun was all they had to protect themselves. It was like bringing a pocket knife to a sword fight. The doctrine made sense on paper back in Ohio and California, where men with clipboards planned missions in quiet offices. Bombers would fly high, drop their loads from 20,000 feet, where fighters and flak couldn't reach them easily, and head home. Precision bombing, they called it. But the Pacific Ocean doesn't care about doctrine. Japanese ships twisted and turned, their captains watching the sky, ready to steer hard the moment they saw bombs falling. Most bombs hit nothing but empty water. The ones that did hit often didn't go off because the fuses weren't designed for that kind of attack. Meanwhile, Japanese gunners had plenty of time to fill the sky with lead, and Zero fighters climbed up to meet the bombers like sharks rising toward a wounded seal. In Australia, at a dusty airbase where mechanics worked under camouflage nets and everyone lived in fear of Japanese bombing raids, a man named Papy Gun was done following rules that got people killed. Everyone called him Pappy, even though he was only in his early 40s, maybe because of the way he looked at young pilots like they were his own sons heading into danger. Gun wasn't supposed to be in the military at all. Before the war, he'd been an airline mechanic in the Philippines, keeping civilian planes flying with spare parts and clever thinking. When the Japanese invaded, his wife and children got trapped in Manila. He escaped by the skin of his teeth and joined the Army Air Force with one thought burning in his mind like a fever. He was going to kill every Japanese ship and plane he could reach until his family was free.
Gunn didn't have fancy engineering degrees from MIT or Caltech. What he had was 30 years of making broken things work with whatever he could find. He looked at the B-25 bombers on the flight line and saw the problem instantly. That clear nose was a death trap. The single forward gun was a cruel joke. If a bomber came in low and fast, right at wave-top height where ship captains couldn't maneuver, it could drop bombs that would skip across the water like flat stones on a pond and punch through ship hulls below the armor. But only if the bomber could survive long enough to get that close, and only if it could kill the gunners on those ships before they killed the bomber crew. In a maintenance hangar that smelled like oil and metal shavings, Gunn started doing something that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone important had been paying attention. He removed the bombardier station completely, that whole clear nose cone that let enemy fighters see the whites of the bombardier's eyes. In its place, he mounted 4 50-caliber machine guns, each one capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Then he added 2 more guns in the cheeks of the nose, angled slightly outward. When he was done, that single forward gun had become 6 heavy machine guns, all firing straight ahead, all triggered by the pilot. A B-25 that used to tickle enemy ships was now a flying gun platform that could cut a destroyer in half. The official channels didn't care. Generals and colonels had bigger problems than one crazy mechanic in Australia playing with spare parts. Combat reports kept coming in with the same terrible story. Bombers sent against Japanese convoys came back shot full of holes, if they came back at all. The few bombs that hit didn't sink ships fast enough. Japanese troops kept landing on New Guinea beaches, kept pushing toward Australia, kept winning. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. Then, in early March of 1943, reconnaissance planes spotted a Japanese convoy heading for New Guinea. 16 ships carrying 7,000 troops and supplies, protected by destroyers and air cover. It was the biggest target Allied forces had seen in months. Every bomber that could fly was thrown at that convoy, including several of Gunn's modified B-25s. The crews flying those strange planes with the solid noses didn't know what to expect. They'd practiced the skip bombing runs, coming in at 50 feet above the waves, so low the spray from their propellers left trails on the water. But practice is one thing. Flying straight at a Japanese destroyer while every gun on that ship tries to kill you is something completely different. The Japanese convoy captains watched the American bombers come in and felt confident. They'd fought off these attacks before. Their gunners knew the drill. Their ships could take some hits and keep fighting. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that war had just changed in a way that would make admirals afraid of daylight.
The modified B-25s came in so low that Japanese sailors on deck could see the pilots' faces through the cockpit glass. What happened next lasted only seconds, but those seconds would echo through the rest of the war. The lead bomber opened fire while still 1,000 yards out, and suddenly the air turned into a solid wall of bullets. 6 50-caliber machine guns firing together sound like a giant ripping canvas, but louder, so loud it drowns out even the roar of the engines. Each gun spat out bullets the size of a man's thumb, 13 rounds every second, and all of them converged on a single point wherever the pilot aimed his nose. The Japanese gunners on the first destroyer never got a chance to shoot back. The American bullets arrived first, tearing through the anti-aircraft positions, shredding the gun shields like tissue paper, killing the men behind them before they could even swing their weapons toward the attacking plane. Then the B-25 was overhead, dropping a 1,000-pound bomb with a special fuse that let it skip across the water like a stone thrown by a giant. The bomb hit the destroyer's side below the waterline where the armor was thinnest and exploded inside the engine room. The ship was dead before the bomber even climbed away. Behind the lead plane came 7 more B-25s, and then the regular bombers following the path the strafers had cleared. One by one, the Japanese transports took the same punishment. Guns that should have been shooting down attackers were silent, their crews dead or diving for cover. Ships that should have been maneuvering were frozen, their bridge crews cut down in the first seconds of the attack. In 3 days of attacks, the entire convoy was destroyed. Every single ship went to the bottom. 7,000 Japanese soldiers drowned or died on burning decks. The Americans lost 4 planes total. News of the Bismarck Sea battle reached North American Aviation's factory in Kansas City within a week, and the executives who read the combat reports understood immediately what they meant. What Papy Gun had done with spare parts and sweat in an Australian hangar, they could do on an assembly line with precision tools and unlimited resources. Within months, the factory floor was reorganized. New B-25s coming down the production line now had solid metal noses instead of clear plastic. Workers installed 8 forward-firing 50-caliber guns as standard equipment, the same way they installed wheels and wings. 4 guns in the nose, 2 in each cheek blister, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the tail, and sometimes waist guns too. Some B-25s left the factory with 18 machine guns total, more firepower than some World War I battleships. The speed of the change revealed something about America that Japanese war planners had failed to understand. What took gun weeks to build in secret, American factories could reproduce in hours, over and over, standardized and perfect. The gun packages came pre-assembled. The ammunition feeds were tested on jigs before installation. Workers followed instruction sheets with pictures, building complexity through simple steps repeated thousands of times. By late 1943, strafer B-25s were rolling off the line at 16 planes per day from multiple factories. Japan's entire aircraft industry produced fewer planes in a month than North American aviation could build in a week. The contrast went deeper than just numbers. American crews flew missions, came back to bases where hot food waited in mess halls that could feed hundreds at once. Industrial kitchens with refrigeration, with standardized menus, with supplies that arrived on schedule because the cargo ships bringing them didn't get sunk. Between missions, there was ice cream. There was Coca-Cola in bottles shipped from stateside, cold from electric refrigerators. There were movies on outdoor screens, mail from home that arrived with clockwork regularity, and spare parts for every single component on every plane. Japanese pilots and sailors captured after ship sinkings saw this abundance firsthand as prisoners, and it broke something in their understanding of the war. One captured merchant captain kept a diary that was later found by American intelligence. His early entries after capture were defiant, full of the expected propaganda about American weakness and Japanese superiority. But as the weeks went by, the tone changed. He wrote about meals with meat at every serving, about bread that wasn't stretched with sawdust, about guards who seemed almost bored with the routine of guarding prisoners because they had so many prisoners it was just another job. He wrote about watching a truck deliver Coca-Cola to the base, cases and cases of it, and realizing that America was shipping soda across the Pacific while Japan was rationing rice to its frontline troops. The diary's final entries before the war ended showed a man coming to terms with a terrible truth. America wasn't just winning the war, America was fighting an entirely different kind of war, one where abundance was a weapon as deadly as any bomb. The straighter B-25s proved it. They didn't mount 8 guns because they needed 8 guns, they mounted 8 guns because they could, because having more bullets than the enemy could dodge was easier than training bombardiers to hit moving targets. It was brute force applied with industrial efficiency, and it worked. Another captured officer, a Navy pilot who'd flown Zeros, watched training footage at a prison camp in Hawaii and sat in silence for an hour afterward. When he finally spoke to the translator, he said the assembly line sequences frightened him more than combat had. He'd been shot at, watched friends die, crashed into the ocean, and nearly drowned. But seeing B-25 strafers built like cars, workers installing gun packages with the casual efficiency of people putting doors on Fords, that made him understand why Japan had already lost before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The war wasn't between two nations, it was between one nation and one giant factory that happened to have an army attached. The moment of complete understanding came for many Japanese prisoners not during interrogation or through propaganda, but in quiet moments when they saw things their officers had promised didn't exist. In the fall of 1944, a captured pilot named Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto sat in a recreation hall at a prison camp outside Honolulu watching a training film. The Americans showed these films to prisoners as part of education programs, thinking maybe it would speed up the war's end if captured men understood how thoroughly they'd been beaten. The film showed the North American aviation factory floor, cameras tracking down assembly lines where B-25 strafer packages were installed with the precision of watchmakers and the speed of lightning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Yamamoto watched workers bolt 8 machine guns into a bomber's nose in less than 15 minutes. He watched ammunition feed systems tested on benches before installation, each belt holding hundreds of rounds, each round manufactured to identical specifications in factories that produced millions of bullets per month. He watched finished strafers roll off the line one after another, each one exactly like the last, each one capable of pouring more lead into the sky in 30 seconds than his entire squadron could carry in a week. When the film ended and the lights came up, Yamamoto didn't move. The American guard asked if he was okay. Yamamoto nodded but couldn't speak yet because his entire understanding of the war had just collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. That night, he wrote in a notebook the camp allowed prisoners to keep. The words came slowly at first, then faster as the dam broke. He wrote that he'd been taught American industry was weak, focused on luxury goods and comfort items, while Japan built weapons with spiritual purity and warrior dedication. He'd believed it because his instructors believed it, because the newspapers said it, because everyone said it. But the training film showed the truth his teachers either didn't know or had hidden. America had turned luxury into a weapon. The same industrial system that made millions of cars and refrigerators and Coca-Cola bottles made bombers with 18 machine guns not because they needed 18, but because the factories could produce 18 as easily as 4. The overkill was casual, almost accidental, like a rich man leaving coins on the table because counting them wasn't worth his time. Yamamoto wrote that he'd thought Bushido, the warrior code, made Japanese forces invincible. Courage and honor would overcome material disadvantages. One Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. The propaganda had said these things so often they became real in his mind. But no code of honor defeats a nation that mounts 8 machine guns where 2 would do and calls it standard equipment. No amount of courage overcomes an enemy that treats war like a manufacturing problem to be solved with better assembly line procedures. The Americans hadn't just outfought Japan, they'd outthought the very concept of fighting, turning it from a test of warrior spirit into a logistics exercise with a body count at the end. Across the Pacific in the Philippines, Papy Gun finally found his family in Manila after American forces liberated the city in early 1945. His wife and children had survived 3 years of Japanese occupation, hungry and afraid but alive. The reunion should have been pure joy, but Gun carried too much weight from the years between. He'd rodified hundreds of planes, trained dozens of crews, attended funerals for young men who'd flown his strafers into enemy fire and didn't come back. One evening after the chaos of liberation had settled slightly, his wife asked him how he'd spent the war. He told her about the guns, the modifications, the Bismarck Sea battle that changed everything. She asked if he was proud of what he'd built. Gunn sat quiet for a long time, watching the sun go down over Manila Bay, over water where Japanese ships still rusted on the bottom. Finally, he said he hadn't invented anything special. He'd just given American boys enough guns that the other guy couldn't shoot back. That wasn't genius, he said, that was just logistics. Any mechanic with access to spare parts and machine shops could have done the same thing. The real genius, if you wanted to call it that, was the system that gave him spare parts and machine shops in the middle of a jungle while the enemy was running out of everything, including hope. He'd just been the first person to weaponize American abundance against Japanese scarcity, to turn the factory advantage into bullets moving faster than the enemy could duck. The deeper truth was sinking in for both sides, prisoner and victor alike. The straighter B-25s represented something more frightening than just firepower. They represented a way of thinking about war that made the old codes and honor systems look like children's games. America had approached the Pacific War like an engineering problem. When high-altitude bombing didn't work, they tried low-altitude strafing. When single guns didn't provide enough firepower, they added more guns until the math worked out. When ships were hard to hit, they invented skip bombing and fuses that exploded underwater. Every problem got a solution, and every solution got mass-produced until it stopped being experimental and started being standard. Japanese prisoners stopped trying to rationalize their defeat as temporary or reversible. They'd fought individual battles. America fought a system war, where victory came not from any single engagement, but from having more of everything, better supply lines, and the industrial capacity to waste resources on purpose, because waste was cheaper than losing. The propaganda had told them Americans were soft, made weak by easy living and material comfort. The propaganda had been exactly backward. The easy living and material comfort were symptoms of a system so powerful it could afford softness, and when that system turned to war, it brought the same overwhelming force that gave every household a car and every soda fountain unlimited Coca-Cola. Yamamoto's diary ended with a single line that captured what many prisoners felt but couldn't articulate. He wrote that in captivity he'd learned the truth propaganda had hidden. America didn't win by being braver. They won by being richer and smart enough to turn money into bullets faster than Japan could turn bullets into hope.
Lieutenant Yamamoto stepped off the repatriation ship in Yokohama Harbor in the spring of 1946, carrying everything he owned in a canvas bag the Americans had given him. Inside were 2 spare shirts, a pair of pants, some toiletries, and a dented Coca-Cola bottle he'd kept from the prison camp. He'd thought about throwing it away a dozen times during the voyage home, but something made him hold on to it. Now, walking through the ruins of what used to be a thriving port city, he understood why. The bottle was evidence, proof that the world he'd fought for and the world that actually existed were 2 completely different things. The destruction went on for miles in every direction. Entire neighborhoods burned down to bare foundations, factories reduced to twisted metal skeletons. The harbor itself was still being cleared of sunken ships, their masts sticking up through the water like grave markers. People moved through the rubble looking for anything useful, anything they could trade or sell or eat. Women in tattered clothes dug through bombed-out buildings. Children with hollow eyes watched the returning prisoners with something that wasn't quite resentment, but wasn't welcome either. The war had ended months ago, but hunger hadn't ended, and neither had the dying. Yamamoto's family home was gone. The entire block was gone. A neighbor directed him to a shelter where his mother and younger sister were living in a single room with 3 other families. His father and older brother had died, his father in the firebombing of Tokyo and his brother in Okinawa. His mother looked 20 years older than when he'd left. She held him and he cried too, but part of his mind was somewhere else. He was thinking about the mess hall at the Hawaiian prison camp, about the meals with meat at every serving, about the casual abundance that had seemed normal by the end. He was thinking about his sister's thin arms and his mother's hollow cheeks, and how much one case of those Coca-Cola bottles could feed them if he could somehow convert glass and sugar water into rice. The contrast hit harder every day. He found work at a warehouse helping to distribute supplies from American occupation forces, and the irony wasn't lost on him. The same nation that had destroyed Japan was now feeding it, shipping in food and medicine to rebuild what the bombers had knocked down. One morning he watched trucks unload at the warehouse, and one of them was carrying aircraft parts being scrapped for metal. He saw a B-25 nose cone, the solid metal kind with gun ports, being hauled to a smelter. The Americans were throwing away bombers now, turning them into raw material because they had so many they didn't need them anymore. Japan had flown planes until the wings literally fell off and still lost. America used planes until they got bored with them and built something newer. He started keeping a journal again, trying to make sense of what he'd seen and what it meant. The entries were raw and honest in a way that would have gotten him arrested during the war. He wrote that Japan had fought with courage, while America fought with factories, and courage wasn't enough. He wrote that the strafer B-25s were perfect symbols of how the war really worked. They didn't mount 18 machine guns because tactics required it. They mounted 18 guns because the question wasn't, do we need this many, but can we afford this many? And the answer was always yes. America could afford to waste bullets, waste bombs, waste entire airplanes, because waste was just another line item in a budget so large it made Japanese military spending look like pocket change. His journal became something more than just personal reflection. Other veterans started reading it, passing pages around, discussing what it meant. Someone suggested he turn it into a book. By 1948, Yamamoto had compiled his prison camp observations and post-war reflections into a manuscript he called The Guns That Ate the Sun, referring to the way strafer fire had blotted out hope the same way clouds cover daylight. A small publisher took a chance on it, and to everyone's surprise, it became a bestseller. Japanese readers were hungry for honest accounts of why they'd lost, and Yamamoto gave them the truth without propaganda or excuses. The book influenced how Japan thought about its future. If America had won through industrial efficiency and mass production, then Japan needed to learn those lessons. The old way of thinking, where craftsmanship and individual quality mattered more than output, had to change. Within a generation, Japan transformed itself into an industrial power, using the same principles Yamamoto had seen in that prison camp training film. Standardization, assembly lines, continuous improvement, waste reduction. The nation that had lost a war to American factories became a nation of factories itself, applying the lessons of defeat to peaceful purposes. In the early 1970s, an elderly Yamamoto visited the United States for the first time as a civilian. He toured several museums and historical sites, and at one of them, aboard the USS Hornet aircraft carrier museum in California, he stood in front of a preserved B-25 strafer. The plane was roped off behind velvet barriers, treated like the historical artifact it was. He stood there for nearly an hour while other tourists walked past, and a museum volunteer finally asked if he was okay. Yamamoto said he was fine, just remembering. He reached out slowly and ran his hand along one of the 8 gun barrels protruding from the nose, feeling the cold metal that had killed so many of his countrymen. He told the volunteer that during the war, Japanese sailors had called these planes flying porcupines because of all the gun barrels sticking out. But the guns hadn't beaten Japan, not really. It was the factory that could afford to waste them that won the war. Papy Gun hadn't invented victory, He'd just made it cheaper, turned it into a product that could be mass-produced and shipped wherever it was needed. The volunteer didn't quite understand, so Yamamoto tried again. He said that in captivity, he'd learned America didn't win by being braver. They won by being richer and smart enough to turn money into bullets faster than Japan could turn bullets into hope. That was the real massacre, not the ships sunk at Bismarck Sea, but the death of the idea that spirit and sacrifice could overcome supply chains and assembly lines. Some lessons, he said, you can only learn by losing everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.